Okay, guys. First of all, we're friends. I deeply admire both of them. I'm fortunate to be here. I'm a movie and television producer, not a professional interviewer, but we're going to give it a shot. I would like to introduce Jony Ive first. He's Sir Jony Ive. He seldom goes by that, but he has been knighted, and you're Sir Jony Ive.
That's right.
He's the Chief Design Officer for Apple, has done many different things, including the Mac, the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad. I could go on and on and on. That's just the beginning. And you've also, by the way, changed the world. So, and JJ, I've also known for quite a while, has mastered every platform. You really have.
What?
Television and movies. You really, and genre.
That's crazy.
You're a writer, you're a director, a producer. You're a genius that's touched so many different people. We just talked about Alias. We did Felicity together, Lost, Mission Impossible, Star Trek, and then for some reason you've decided now to do Star Wars, which we're going to discuss. All right, JJ, pretty gutsy move. I mean, you've decided to do Star Wars, which is an enormous acquisition that Disney made. It's probably the greatest cinema mythology in the 20th century. Why'd you decide to? How did you decide to do this? How and why?
Well, first of all, thank you for having us and for being here. The truth is that when Kathy Kennedy called and asked if I would be interested in doing Star Wars, my honest knee-jerk reaction was, thank you, but no thank you. Partly because I had been involved in things like Mission Impossible and Star Trek, and the idea of doing another reboot, prequel, sequel, I just didn't want to do that again in theory. But Star Wars meant so much to me that I felt like I'd rather just go to the cinema. I'd rather just see the movie. And so I said, thank you, but no thank you. And she said, can we at least get together and talk about it? And I said, sure. And I'd known Kathy for a long time. So she came over, and I fully intended to say in person, thank you, but no thank you. And we started talking about Star Wars. Like, it wasn't just a title and a name and a thing that I knew and cherished. We got into some specifics of, like, what if? And the fact is, I left that meeting without having answered the question if I would be interested, because I found myself so touched by the idea and excited by the idea of being involved in it. And for me, I don't try and look at things from the outside in and apply some kind of logic. There's no strategy or game plan. I had this drive to, so I ran to downstairs to see Katie, my wife, and we were in our office, and I said to her, she's like, how'd the meeting go? And I said, I really want to do this. And we had this plan to go away with our kids, and we had this whole thing, and she said to me, this is clearly a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and if you say no, you will regret it, so you should just think about it. Do you really want to do it? And I did, and so it was, I knew it was a crazy thing to do, given the passion for it. It's a religion for some people.
It's a movement.
It's a movement, and it's now that we're into October, it's getting real.
You mean the judgment's getting real? The pressure of finishing is getting it real?
When you say it's coming out in 18 months,
yeah,
it's so easy.
Yeah.
When you say it's coming out, it's a year away. It's like, okay,
Right.
It's not for 6 more months. When you get into like 3 months, it starts to get like, the heat goes up a little bit, and you're like, So it's nerve-wracking, the notion of it. But every time I get overwhelmed and freaked out, I just look at the work everyone's done, right. And I can't help but be really excited about it.
How much do you get to, and there's so many questions, how much do you get to create within the realm of Star Wars?
Well, the thing is that...
where does the creation come from?
First of all, I got to work with Lawrence Kasdan, who,
right.
for me, was a cinematic hero, a writer-director. And he wrote Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. And starting, work with him on that was an extraordinary thing. It was an education. It was a blast. And we got to really talk about, what would delight us? What do we want to see in this world? The Star Wars world is so vast in some ways, but to me, the thing that I love so desperately about the very first movie was it couldn't have been bigger, more epic, more vast, and yet the story was remarkably intimate. It was remarkably emotional. It was remarkably focused on these hearts and characters and these relationships and these friendships. And so for me, and for Lawrence Kasdan, going into this, it was really about how do we possibly get that feeling back of people that we love, that make us laugh and make us feel in a world that is jaw-dropping. And that was always the kind of, the one mandate if there was one.
Right. Jony, it's a privilege to talk to you on stage. And you don't talk about this often, but Steve Jobs. So you spent 14 very, very, very intense years with him. Probably saw him almost every day of your life. Probably had lunch with him 3 to 4 times a week. Went on family vacations together. Delivered the eulogy, his eulogy. He spoke of you as his spiritual partner. How do you remember him?
I think it's been there's been a curious transition over the last 4 years. I was talking to actually a friend of Steve's and a good friend of mine earlier in the week when the day that marked the 4th anniversary of his death. And one of the things that really struck me was at that point 4 years ago, I was very conscious. I was faced really with this wall of grief, but an awful lot of very messy, a whole series of multiple feelings. And in thinking of him then, there was just this incredible complexity of all of his different characteristics and attributes. And what has been really quite surprising, I'm not sure really what I should have expected, but over the 4 years that have passed, that so much of that noise and so many of those attributes, they ended up in some ways just receding, and somehow what was essentially him and what really mattered was what's remained in terms of my memory. And quite honestly, what's remained I never would have predicted 4 years ago. And what's remained is somehow shocking in how unremarkable in some ways it is, but that it was his very, very simple focus on trying to make something really beautiful and great. And it really was simple. It wasn't, there wasn't heartwarmingly simple. There wasn't this grand plan of winning or a very complicated agenda. That the simplicity seemed almost childlike in its purity and its truth. And what was shocking was, and what I sort of visually remember, is somehow in reaction to that was, I don't think I've ever seen anybody so happy as I've seen him, just this very simple joy when you sort of realize, actually this is actually working out. This is actually going to be good. This could be great.
Right.
But it was just the simplicity of that, and that stands in such stark, obviously stands in such stark contrast to the way that he's being frequently and popularly portrayed at the moment. But the just lack of agenda and the selfless he worked so incredibly hard, and it wasn't to make products for himself or for me. I mean, the whole idea was that we made quite a few of them. And there was this, I spoke at the eulogy, and I mean, somewhat self-conscious of this because it sounds just a little bit grand, but was very aware that he certainly had a sense of a civic responsibility to make something good. And it's a way that you can somehow make a contribution to humanity and to culture. But yeah, it was that, the simplicity was what I'm sort of left with now,
Right.
Which is beautiful and at the same time a little heartbreaking.
Right. And when in your work relationship, the one-on-one, would you, when an inspiration happened, if you had an inspiration, would you tell him first, or how would that work at the most basic incubation of an idea?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because our process, I mean, one of the things that was just so special was his reverence for the creative process. And particularly a creative process in the context of a large organization. It's not the easiest because of how irritably unpredictable ideas are. And he guarded it zealously and could articulate the importance much better than I could. So there was certainly that sense of sort of looking after me a bit. But it was, yes, it didn't start with drawing, it started with conversations. And isn't it, I mean, I'm sure this is similar, well, actually I know it's the same for JJ, but just that wonderful from nothing, you tentatively start to build something, but with words and with what you can visualize. And he was fantastic at listening. I mean, we know often the very best ideas come from a very quiet voice. And somehow we're conditioned to listen to the big, loud voice, the bold voice that doesn't even possibly entertain, the idea that they could be wrong. And my experience has been so often the most fabulous, glorious ideas have come from a tentative suggestion. And that's how we worked. And in between times we would, as a design team, we would draw and start to put form and make what were abstract ideas physical. And that always really helps, I think, galvanize a team that's working on something that's, up until that point, trading in fairly abstract concepts.
Actually, will you both turn nothing into something? Both of you. I mean, when you make a movie, you're starting at sort of a place of ether, and when you're building a product, it's an ether. I mean, how do you see it? I mean, share ideas with that.
I think that anyone who
because this nothing turns into something, a product or a tangible idea that becomes a movie. Like Star Wars is going to be judged by millions of people.
Thanks, Brian. Dozens and dozens of people will.
More than dozens.
I feel like the process is always miraculous, and the truth is that for me, it gets harder every time in a way that I don't understand. Now, it might be because the last time you did it, you pulled out those tricks and you came up with those things, so you think, well, there can't be anything left. But it's, even in just writing a script, I find that every time I write a script or I'm working on something, I'm perplexed that I'd ever done it before. And I know I did, and I remember it, but it's a crazy thing, and I don't think I understand, certainly better than anyone does, why and how it works. But I think the critical thing is curiosity and asking the right questions. And I would love to, at some point in this quick chat, talk about the process of actually writing, because when I did this TED Talk years ago, I made a comment that got a laugh. And it was not intended to get a laugh. But I was talking about my at the time, PowerBook. And I said, I have this device, this tool that I use to write. And because of what it feels like, I literally ask myself, what do I have to write that is worthy of this laptop? And what I mean is that it's almost like when you buy a pen that you love. And I love pens. And when you have the right pen,
yes,
it actually helps you. Because it's a weirdly inspirational thing, and you feel like that you rise to it somehow. And so when I'm coming up with ideas, I often find myself using some shitty notebook and any pen, whatever it is, I'll grab whatever's around. But that's usually about just kind of throwing out the big what ifs and the sort of fundamental questions. But when I start to write and kind of outline things, I kind of graduate to the laptop, which allows me, despite using various things that let me move things around and everything, it's a little bit like, it's like putting on a tie. It's like, okay, I'm going to work now, and there's especially with the products that you have had such a remarkable hand in creating, there's a very strange thing that you guys have done that no one else has in kind of anthropomorphizing and making both wildly comfortable, invisible, intuitive, and creative, and at the same time so beautifully done that you realize nothing is a mistake, nothing is by accident, and there's a formality to its comfortableness. There's a formality, and it's this amazing sweet spot of clearly of form and function, but it's even more than that, a kind of relationship that I have, that when I go to work on that, it says to me anything is possible. It says to me this is a tool that will be a bridge between that what if and the final product. And that is a priceless thing to have.
And I think we are ever so aware of what we make our tools. And because, this isn't the rhetoric in terms of, we're mindful of our customers. In some ways, we're terrified of them because they're people like JJ. And so these tools are important. And if you think, it's partly probably one of my foibles, but sometimes in museums, and you look in, some of the ancient tools are beyond extraordinarily beautiful. And I think there's a fabulous history and biography of tools being significant. And I think that if you're trying to, I've talked about this before, but I think the majority of our manufactured environment is characterized by carelessness. It's that everything that has been made, there's a biography to it, there's a story to it, and it exists really at the end of a whole bunch of decisions. And most of those decisions were driven by price and schedule. And we have genuinely tried to make products that don't stand testament to that sort of development process or don't stand testament to those values. They stand testament to us desperately trying to make the very best product we can, because we know someone like JJ is going to sit down and stare at this screen, and he will sense, he won't be able to articulate it, but we hope that he will sense the care that went into it.
Wow.
And I do believe that we're capable of discerning far more than we're capable of articulating. And I remember we discovered this when the iPod started to actually sell in some sort of volume. And we'd been doing some fairly reckless things, like finishing the inside of the iPod, that that cost money and it cost time. And we did it just because we thought it was right, and we had a theory that people would sense that amount of care was invested in the object. but it was a theory. And when the iPod started to sell in large volumes, there was this tremendous encouragement, because it was this sense that actually people really do care. They really do, if they're given the choice. And sadly, we very often don't give people that choice. It's a choice based on price or availability.
So do you, I mean, you've talked, speaking to this, but do you also create a story? Does each thing that you work on, is there a story to it? Does it begin with a story or a need, or is it?
Well, it's certainly not quite as impressive as JJ's stories, but it's there's a reason. And I mean, we won't make something unless we believe we can make it better. And we try. We try every time that, you know, we release something, we have to somehow believe that we can do it better. But what we refuse to do is to then launch something that's just different. Right. And there's tremendous pressure to do that. But no, we want it to be better and to perform, you know, to functionally be better, to have utility that surpassed, you know, the previous product. And yes, there's not one screw that we've made. You know, we don't assemble off-the-shelf components. Everything we have made specifically for the job that we're trying to, you know, solve there.
So within the story for both of you, how does emotionality enter? I mean, certainly in our world, I actually always say that I'm in the feelings business, and that, you know, I'm looking to find ideas and images that will ignite emotionality, ultimately just feelings, and feelings aren't predictive. But you should speak to that. I mean, how does feelings enter your world, JJ? Again,
it's a weird thing, because sometimes ideas come from a kind of concept or a world. Other times they come from a scene or an idea for a character. There's no rule, but again, like I said before, I don't typically think, well, what's not there? And what should be there, or what is the thing what's that, you know, people talk about the white space and trying to find it. I think that naturally, and there is certainly no more successful a producer and storyteller than yourself, and your gut is famous. You are known for having like a divining rod for what should we do, and the reason that you and Ron have been so immensely successful and had such longevity as friends and colleagues is that you, my guess is, don't look and say, you know, there isn't, you know, this kind of movie out there right now, we should go into it. You just kind of go, ooh, that sounds good. Or you have an idea, or you read something, or you meet someone, or you get an idea for a character or something. And I feel like it's a very strange thing. I was at a baseball game recently with Stephen King, and he was telling me about this idea he has for this story he wants to write, and he was talking about it in a way, and yes, what he was telling me was fucking terrifying, but it was the way he was telling it that was so incredible to me, because he was saying it like this. He was like, well, I know, I'm not going to say what the story was, because he would then kill me. But he said, I know that there's this person who, and he started talking about things, and I know that there, and listening to the way he was saying what he knew, because he hadn't worked on it, he hadn't sat down and outlined it, there was no strategy to it. But it was like he was just, his intuition of what it should be, and he knew enough to know he's got something to take that leap of faith. And any creation, any act of creation, is a leap of faith. Mm. And I just think that it's part of it, the fun of it is knowing that it may work. and he, you know, that, and then the other thing I just want to say, which is years ago, I was working with James L. Brooks, who, you know, did some of my favorite movies and TV shows, and this is 20 some years ago, but I remember I was reading a book about how he wrote broadcast news. and how he structured it, and how at a certain point in Act 2 there was this transition, and then at the end of Act 2 to Act 3 he'd done this and all this stuff. And I said to him one day, I was like, Jim, so I just want to ask you something about broadcast news. When you did that transition from the second act to the third act, did you know that Jane was going to do this? And he was like, what are you talking about? And I said, well, that thing. He's like, what transition? And what I realized was, because it was all bullshit, was that the writer of this book on how to write screenplays had deconstructed what James L. Brooks had written and had written about how he had done it. But he hadn't done it that way. He just wrote and told a story that he believed in, and he found it. But you can always deconstruct, as companies do left and right, what you make. And they can go, oh, this is what they did, and this is why they did it. And they can deconstruct it and then try and, but they're already starting from a place of artifice, of duplication, as opposed to a place that I know you and I know how you do it, of authenticity and I feel this thing that should exist. And you take that leap of faith that it may work.
Yes. I mean, that's actually one of the odd places I think we find ourselves in is, as designers, we are living, and we have to be comfortable living in the future where there's an awful lot of ambiguity in terms of there's not a lot of very specific answers to the questions that we've got. But because you can be sort of habitually, your gaze rests right out there, your preoccupation's there. And there's this strange tendency that you tend to dismiss sort of the now and history. And one of the things that's funny, JJ touched on the creative process and faith.
Yes.
And that's a word that comes up a lot when we're working, which is, of course, we're the product of having more experience because we've been doing this for a long time. But because of how unpredictable, you can't take, many of my colleagues in the organization that I work in can apply this number of people for this amount of time and be fairly confident, fairly sure on what the outcome will be, except what we do. We just don't know. And so in that place of feeling really quite vulnerable, one of the things that I've just made really quite a shocking habit of is to pay very, very close attention to the history of how we actually managed to get through. Mm-hmm. And part of that is to make these declarations about, well, we were exactly here 7 years ago, and we thought that was it, and the sky was falling. And we're completely convinced in our own personal ineptitude. But it's just wonderful to be able to replay example and example of, actually, but by faith, we actually did end up all right. We did figure this out. And part of the human condition, I guess, is that we somehow forget the complete and utter terror and trauma that we go through every time. I mean, we talk about it, and it does make you feel a lot better. But it really is.
But as successful as you both are, you're tortured all the time. On every new idea.
I mean, torture doesn't begin to capture it, Brian. It's, but it's true and it's lovely, isn't it? I mean, to be, yeah. And it doesn't get easier. To JJ's point, I mean, I honestly thought, oh, come on, we've been doing this for a while now. I mean, surely there's going to be some. Well, that was one of the things with Steve. He'd been doing it for the longest, and he cared the most, and he didn't presume once that he had some sort of entitled, well, of course, I'm Steve Jobs, and this will happen at the end. He did not work that way at all.
By the way, do you think that, because you're known to have tremendous focus as well, do you think you and Steve had similar focus? It was just manifested differently? Similar intensity, but manifested differently?
No.
Or complete compatibility and things were different?
I think complete compatibility, but he beat me on the focus about 84-3. I mean, this is still, to this day, I find it's one of those things that sounds so trite,
right,
and so glib,
right,
But when you meet somebody who really knows how to focus, it's quite remarkable.
Right.
And the way that he would measure and try and help me to improve my focus score was to ask me, how many times did you say no today? Because he would say, you can measure focus, and I would have these, sacrificial no's, and he would know they were sacrificial no's. And he said, but come on, Jony, how many things did you say no to?
You guys were tallying.
That you really, really
That's
wanted to do.
Yeah.
And it's a deeply uncomfortable but really effective, it's really true. And I think the discipline to turn your back on something that you believe in passionately, but so that you can apply yourself to what's at hand, I think is remarkable. I really think it's a remarkable, it's more than a practice, it's more than a habit. It's I don't know, it's just a wonderful ability.
Yeah. Does that live in your space at all, JJ?
No.
You're impulsive.
No, I mean, you have to, like you, I work at a company where there's a lot of stuff going on, and you need to make sure that you aren't distracted by a million things at once. But when you say that, the question literally of how many times do you say no, that's an incredible thing to work with someone who values the rejection of distraction and other things.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
And you turn it into an art form, all those invitations. You feel a little less worthless and guilty about you're saying no for a very good reason.
Yeah, righteous no, yeah.
Yeah, and need to improve the no score, definitely.
What secret do you want to divulge right now about some no that you're saying? No, I'm kidding. Jony, in terms of design, you have recently, and you haven't publicly spoken to this a lot, but how has your role at Apple been redesigned? How did you redesign that, or how did you guys collectively redesign it? And Apple, of course, is the company that you've been at and love and adore. How's that changed?
Well, I think it's a fairly sobering realization, but I have one competence. I mean, the only thing I can do is design. And the problem is when you really look at how you spend your time, insidiously you can realize you're spending your time on stuff other than design. And so we really just wanted to reconfigure things. And so over the summer, we made some changes. And so now all I do is design. That's meant that I've had to step back from certain things and had to say no to a bunch of things.
So in a weird way, you get to do more. Or
I get to do more design.
Part that you like.
And I get to say no to stuff that I hated doing anyway. And didn't do very well, if I'm honest. And so by moving away from certain things, I can really focus on, my first love remains, of course, the product, and desperately trying to make better products. But for years, I've been involved in the design of other things that we've been making at Apple. I've been lucky enough to work with, the most remarkable architects who have been designing our new campus, who are a London-based company called Foster and Partners. So I've been doing things like that, and I've been working on our sort of new retail spaces. But I always felt that they were slightly naughty, under the radar sort of activities and things like that. And so now they're all completely legitimate. And I've just stepped back from sort of management and administrative stuff. And quite honestly, I should have done this a long time ago. I haven't felt this happy and honestly this creative for years and years. It's working out quite
That's
nice.
great. That's great for you. That's great for Apple.
Well, I think it is. It's good for both of us. But the most valuable contribution I can make to Apple certainly isn't my administrative prowess. But the design stuff normally has a use.
That's awesome. JJ, I want to go back to Star Wars for a second.
Okay.
Because Star Wars is the thing that everybody talks about. and even more and more. You have more. By the way, is there any sleepless nights for J.J. Abrams on Star Wars? Or should we get Katie to answer that question?
Well, when Harrison Ford got injured on the set,
Yeah.
that was, how do you say, not ideal and scary. There were a couple times here and there, but honestly,
Once
I
you
sleep
decide
pretty
to
well.
go, you go.
Yeah.
It's unusual for, I mentioned that I spoke to Bob Iger about this, who, the CEO of Walt Disney Company, and it's a huge thing for everybody. It's a huge thing for him, and I know that he, worked with you a bit on it, which is quite unusual. But I think you liked that. And what was that collaboration all about?
Here's the thing. First of all, he spent $4 billion on it. So
yes.
he has the right to come by whenever the hell he wants to. That's first of all. Secondly, they let me make the movie.
Yeah.
They let us make the movie we wanted to make. Bob, who I've known for a while and since years ago, and the TV shows we did. And
since Alias and everything.
I've known him for a long time. I mean, he's been a friend. He's been an incredible supporter, and he would send me texts. What are you doing? How's it going? He'd call me. I'd call him. It was. I know he's the CEO of Disney. All I saw was a guy who bought this thing, let me do something with it, and
wants it to be good.
He's as much a part of this, certainly, as he wants to be. But he's been an incredible collaborator on it, and has great ideas, and mandates nothing. Like, he doesn't come in and say, well, we at Disney, he'll come and look at something and he'll say, that's cool, and he'll ask questions and he'll make some suggestions. But it's been. I was nervous about it because, you get like Final Cut on a movie, but when you do
Final Cut?
Yeah, but when you do a Disney thing,
okay, yeah.
But when you do a Disney project, there's like that, clause in there that you kind of go, well, if I were a lawyer, I could probably drive a truck through it, and I was always kind of worried, like, well, are they going to pull out some, I cannot say enough about how Bob Iger and Alan Horn have kind of understood this thing that they now is now part of the Disney company, and they're not trying to Disneyfy it. They're not doing anything other than, I think, an incredibly smart thing, which is letting Kathleen Kennedy, who is a remarkable person and producer, run and lead Lucasfilm to a place where I think it wants to go.
It's interesting. I mean, Bob, is on the Apple board.
He is, yeah.
And plays a really important.
He's a man that can do many things.
He can.
There's so many Star Wars. By the way, I know that you guys know each other, had a great evening together once at a party, and in some way, did Jony have any...
That sounds very suspicious, by the way.
I know it did, I know. I knew that was coming. Okay. Has Jony had any influence on your life, or have you had any influence on Johnny's life? But I think there's some story embedded there.
Well, I mean, if I can just say, as the person who went to the Moscone Center when Steve Jobs announced the iPhone, and I would sign on and watch the keynotes live, and I was one of those many people who. I've been this, fanatic of the work that you and your team have done for so long. And one of my colleagues, Roger Guyette, who's a visual effects supervisor, is an old friend of yours. And so I knew that he knew Jony Ive. So without trying to be obnoxious about it, any time I could, I'd ask a little question about Jony Ive, and I always wanted to meet you. And so when we finally got to sit together at a Vanity Fair dinner one night, it was, I just had to restrain myself from being a sycophantic asshole, because I was just, I was so, I would watch all your videos. So, and you would be describing how you cut this thing out of one piece of aluminum, and I was like, oh my God. So, yes, you had a huge impact on my life, and I know I've had none on yours, and that's all fine.
No, what JJ didn't know was that I'd been I'd been very sneaky and contrived the whole seating plan to make sure that JJ sat next to me.
Really?
Absolutely.
That was choreographed.
And
brilliant.
no, we had an absolutely fabulous dinner and a productive dinner.
Well, here's a joint question. That's awesome. If there are any ingredients to giving birth to a breakthrough, what are those ingredients? I mean, I wrote a book about curiosity, so I think curiosity is a valuable tool. But you guys are quite brilliant creators and master artists. So,
well, the thing that struck me about it was absolutely absurd how quickly we got on. But I think one of the reasons was that we are cut from the same cloth around curiosity. And I don't know. I mean, I think that's what really defines me, because curiosity means that at some level you're completely comfortable with being wrong.
right.
And curiosity gives space to other people. It doesn't steal their oxygen. And the what ifs and sadly, it's a lot rarer. I mean, for some reason, I guess just in the line of what I do, I'm lucky enough to bang up against people who are fabulously curious. But I do think that was just one of the, man, did we get started in on a what-if conversation. It's funny, like at an end of a project, I've always been really clear about this. I always think there's two things that you end up producing. Or there's two consequences of a big project. There's the thing that you were working on, and then I would argue of a much more significance is all that you learned to make the thing. Because that is obviously the stone that you're going to build on. But I don't know, that vitality and that being light on your feet and that being just fine when you're wrong. I mean, obviously we don't want to do it too often, but I don't know. I love being around people that are just, that are surprised. I think of, Steve was discerning and he was critical. He was critical always in service of the idea, but he was never cynical. And to me, cynicism for creatives is, it's kryptonite. It just causes, it's havoc.
But I think that the key, though, is, if I could say, that I think you're absolutely right, and at the same time, you don't want that sycophantic voice, the person who's always saying yes, and to find the people to work with who are practically, constructively, painfully critical, and it's a challenge. And the what if part, I just wanted to say, the other day, my son, 17, came in and said, I found these notebooks in your office, and I had dozens of notebooks, and he was just looking through some of these old things, and they're from years ago, and some more recent, but they're all the notebooks of ideas and things, and I don't go back to look at them, but I did, and I was flipping through some, and they were all what if, and that idea of sitting typically alone, and I know you like to go to coffee shops in New York, and that's where I work the best myself, and to look at what my process is, which is literally asking all these questions, I think for me, it goes hand in hand with the answer that makes you laugh. The answer, when you have a what if something, and it just, you can't quantify it, you don't need to rationalize it, you just go, oh my God. Like there's a feeling you get, and I know that, especially in television, when we've had ideas for things and then executed them, and then yes, days, weeks, and months go by, but in TV it's fairly quick, and all of a sudden it's a couple months later and it's on. And when it works and people have the reaction that you had back in the room, and you go, oh my God, they're getting to experience the exact same thing that we did when we were like, oh, what if that? And I just, the what ifs are everything, but it's like when you catch a fish and the what if yields an emotional, visceral reaction. That to me is the only thing I think that is close to a litmus test for what might work.
Wow, same with you? Do you feel certainty? You feel, that's amazing though. Is that Are you able to do a similar thing?
No, I think there's a certain level of conviction when I feel it's really obvious this is going to change everything. And so then there's a very quiet confidence with that. And then you get slammed up against here's 5 reasons why this one won't change everything, but also is inherently a stupid idea and won't work. And it's somehow hanging on to, it's just hanging on to that first reaction. And it's a tricky one because, I mean, there is that, and I will butcher this quote, I'm ever so sorry. It's a George Bernard Shaw thingy, but it's about innovation takes the unreasonable man. And if you really think about what he's saying, that's incontrovertible. Of course it does. Because if it's new, it defies received wisdom. But what does that look like? I mean, again, this goes back, I think, to some of the ridiculous things that have been written about Steve, because they have been written without the beginnings of an understanding about the creative process and what you have to do to make progress. So if you say to somebody, I really want to be able to do this, and they say no, and you say, I don't believe you, I want to see some evidence, that doesn't mean that you're an arsehole.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that your hobby is arguing.
Right.
And the problem is that happens at so many stages that it's so easy that if you don't engage, if you don't take the time to remember, well, wait a minute, what was he actually doing? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's not a huge, that perhaps there's a little bit of acrobatics in trying to figure that out, but try and remember what he was doing and who he was confronting, and he was having arguments with silicon chip designers on that side and thermal designers on this side, and his intuition was such that I would say 8 times out of 10, his intuition was right.
Wow. And you personally lived in that intimate space. Other people didn't live in that intimate space.
And I didn't just do it for a week. Yeah. It was for 14 years.
Yeah.
And I saw that, and I saw him working with the most phenomenal engineers.
Wow.
And I just think it's important to remember, well, you could have had somebody who didn't ever argue, but you wouldn't have the phones that you have now, and a whole list of other things.
Wow.
And we wouldn't have moved things forward. And it may be, perhaps it's not the phones right now, it's going to be what are the next 3 generations that build on those phones, on the watch. And we wouldn't have those things. And so I do think it's just terribly important to remember that the context of what those conversations were.
Yeah, it's very powerful.
I think so.
Yeah, thank you. We're supposed to do Q&A. Oh, there's people ready to ask questions. Okay, you're highlighted.
Hi, I'm Oliver Riddle from UC Berkeley. My question's from JJ, but so Jony, please chime in if you have any thoughts. JJ, as someone who has worked in TV, film, experimented with IMAX 3D, here we've learned and heard a lot about virtual reality. And from the technology point of view, it's clearly a very exciting time to be in virtual reality. I'm interested to hear your thoughts from a content creator's point of view, where, especially from a kind of feature-length content, where it could be and where it could go in the future, and what your views are on it.
Well, I'm very excited about what is possible. I think that there are many obvious questions that exist about how VR can best function, and I think it is an incredibly exciting tool that can and will be applied to very specific types of experiences. And just the way you can play a game now and have an experience that 20 years ago would have been an impossibility, I think 20 years from now we'll see experiences that you could not have possibly imagined that will be as visceral and real. I mean, I've had experiences using this most simplistic version, which is Google Cardboard, and I've used it, and I've been to this one, I'm thinking of Clouds Over Sidra, where you are in a refugee camp and you're with this young woman young girl who's eating dinner with her family. Now, I know I didn't actually go there, but I can tell you, there they were having dinner. I was in their tent. I looked around. I looked up. I saw the seams in their tent. Like, I can remember it as an experience. I will tell you there's something that is being worked on now that will involve Star Wars that when I experienced it, I had such a visceral sense memory experience of being on the set that it was uncanny. And I thought, how cool when it becomes easy for people to do a 360 virtual experience photograph, that they will be able to do, pictures of their rooms or whatever, and you'll get to be a grown-up and go back into your room and look around and see everything and as if you were actually standing there. I think it is really exciting. I think there are obvious limitations, and I don't think it's a square peg, round hole scenario. And I think when you start to see some of the things that are being worked on now in that space, and as the technology makes it more and more what it will inevitably be, I think it's going to be an extraordinary new platform for not just experience, but interaction.
Yes, sir?
Hi there, Jony. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about sort of the cottage industry of Steve Jobs movies and things that have come up. And have you seen the Steve Jobs movie? Will you see it? And how do you sort of feel about that whole world that's emerging, particularly in light of what you just shared?
That is the sweetest description I've heard. Cottage industry. You mean the one that involves Sony? Yeah, there's an awful lot I can say. I haven't seen the film. I've talked at length with friends, both of Steve and of me, who have seen the film. I just think that there is I don't know, this is a sort of a primal fear of mine. This touches quite deep, I think, for me, in that how you are defined and how you are portrayed can be hijacked by people with agendas that are very different from your close family and from your friends. And I don't really know what more to say, but there are sons and daughters and widows and very close friends who are completely bemused and completely upset. And yet again, we're celebrating, we are remembering Steve's life, and at the same time, beautifully choreographed is the release of a movie, and I don't recognize this person at all. And I'm sorry to sound a bit grumpy about it, but I just find it ever so sad. Because, he had his triumphs and his tragedies, like us all. Unlike most of us, he's having his identity described, defined by a whole bunch of other people. And I think that's a bit of a struggle personally.
Great. I think we're going to end on one final question that I was going to ask you both. You've won so much in life, but what does it look, when you really add things up, what does it look like? What does winning look like, personally? Or it can blend professionally, culturally. What does winning look like?
Well, I mentioned earlier about this, being very aware of, we make a thing, and then being very aware of, we learnt a lot. Mm. And I think there's something really special, and I know JJ and I are similar in this way, and that we value the teams that we're lucky enough to work with. Mm. for me, I think winning is to continue to learn in community. I think somehow it is, being wrong gets slightly less painful. It's indicative of the fact that we are really trying, and I just love learning new stuff. I really do love learning new stuff. And I think in 15 years' time, I will remember the way we worked, probably more than the product of the way we worked. Because essentially, I think you can say, if the way we worked had any gravitas, if it had any value, it should yield things that were useful. And I think it has done so far. Not always, but generally I think it has. And so I'm really interested in the process, the creative process, and the learning, I think.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
And that feels like I'm winning.
JJ?
I'm not sure it's going to be very different from what you just said, except less articulate. But I will say that I think that as you well know, making a movie or doing a TV show takes an enormous amount of time from an enormous amount of people who are spending time away from their families. And it's an investment of a lot of money, incredible resources, and I know it's not God's work. People are out there doing things that are far more important. But in the world of entertainment, what you're investing all that in is in just desperately trying to give something to people that will be worthy of their time, and if you're lucky, memorable. And to know that that has happened, even if the thing itself isn't a success, even if it dies a quick and horrible death. We don't have posters of our movies or anything at the office, but if there were something that we loved, that we felt we succeeded at, but it got canceled instantly or no one went, I'd put that poster up on that theoretical wall, because I feel pride that we did something that was worth people's time, not because it was in the top 10 TV shows or number one for the weekend or anything. So I think it's just being aware that you're in this community of people who are all, when they're with you, not with their kids.
Wow.
And you want to do something that's worthy not just of the audience's time, but of the time of the people who made it, put into it.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.